Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hodlcast. Today is March 21st, and we have a special guest, Dr. Brian Goss. And Brian, maybe you could give us a little bit of your background, how you got into Bitcoin and, what you're doing in the space these days.
I'm a physician, a radiologist by trade. I was very fortunate to have read a Slashdot article in July 2010, colloquially referred to as the first Slashdotting. And my background, I did undergraduate in astrophysics and math and started a PhD in engineering before going to medical school. So when I read the white paper, I had sort of a good background for at least understanding, what the Bitcoin concept was all about. I'm not a programmer, not a good programmer, but so the code was not accessible to me. But the white paper is written in a very informal, colloquial fashion. Like it's not written like a very, very scientific paper, and it made sense. I was like, oh, this seems like it would work. I certainly can't see why it wouldn't work. And out of a naive hope that this might someday actually turn into something useful, I started mining Bitcoins with my then relatively new laptop. And back then it worked. Like you could turn on your laptop and, hey, I got 50 of these whatevers. They were, quote, generated. As before we had the term mining. And I mined for about a week. At the time, obviously on a laptop, you can't use your laptop very long without being connected to power. And my wife and I were sharing the computer, and so she had to, put a call an end to that. So before there was Mt. Gox, there was some kind of Bitcoin marketplace. I remember I bought. I spent $20 on Bitcoin when it was like 10 cents a piece, and I remember thinking, kind of a waste of money. But boy, I hope someday this might help somebody out. And I've been in that situation of being a young person, trying to physically save and defend cash in a, let's call it an adversarial environment, and having, gotten it all stolen because I couldn't, provide for its defense. It really, it was a big event in my life. Like, oh man, I'm trying to save up. I want to go to college. I got nothing around. And when you're not valuable enough to a bank, right? Like, what do you do? Well, you're kind of screwed. So that's why I mined was, hey, if this thing could ever scale to be so big that, you could have thousands of kids storing hundreds of dollars, like this would be, a huge win in my book. So that's sort of how I got started in it. I, mined for a little bit and I poked around the forums, asked some questions, and then forgot about it for a year. And June 2011 was going to reformat my hard drive because my computer was acting up. And I was like, oh wait, I should check in on this Bitcoin thing. So I backed up one private key, basically, and formatted my hard drive, started over. And being an early person in Bitcoin makes you probably the least objective, most biased observer possible. A lot of us early Bitcoin people have we had sort of it took a while to understand what it is, and we're still learning, what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is, it is what it is, not what we think of it. And what we think of what Bitcoin is, it changes as years go by. And, at the beginning, there were people starting, blatantly illegal companies, right? Not realizing, this new magical internet money can put you in prison for doing trivial programmatic things that are, not legal. So I've seen a little bit of just about everything in the Bitcoin space. So what do I do? I'm a physician. I love what I do, and work in a group of similarly like-minded people. I don't think I'll ever stop working. So I don't do anything particularly in Bitcoin, but other than give free advice to people who ask.
Very nice. Well, what keeps you the most excited about Bitcoin these days?
So a couple things. One, a lot of those early people did not recognize the importance of being able to validate the chain from Genesis till now. We just kind of always figured all you need to do is stay synchronized at the tip. You can always ask a friend, hey, what's the most recent block hash and things like that. And now that a lot of us perhaps Roger Ver accepted, understand what the real security model is for Bitcoin and why that's important and how any form of trust will eventually get abused. I think Bitcoin is actually now on a pretty solid footing for the future. The Lightning Network, being able to scale off chain, is huge. It's obviously a requirement in order for people to be able to validate the money for themselves, which to me, as a prerequisite for valuing it at all, that's we've got a footing that might actually justify its price. For the longest time, the price of Bitcoin was fairly, divorced from its utility, its scalability, things like that. The bigger problems are going to be fungibility and privacy, right? This obviously is technically difficult. There's a whole bunch of cool work that I don't know a whole lot about with Wasabi Wallet and Samurai Wallet and MeshNet Relay stuff that I think will eventually make it so that even regular people can achieve privacy. But as of now, it's an art more so than a science. If you want to actually be private, but that'll be the next big battleground. We lost a few people with the block size thing, and
do you have a good understanding of what exactly happened with the block size debate too? Because I have a feeling you probably were watching it for years.
Oh yeah, and I admit I was totally on the wrong side of it to begin with. The real question, the fundamental question is and like a lot of debates that seem to go on and on forever, it's usually there's two sides are assuming different things to begin with. If you start with the assumption all you need to do is stay synchronized at the tip of the chain, you can do this on an old T1 line, 1.5 megabit per second connection, no problem. You can do it with Raspberry Pi level hardware, and I did it. I had a T1 line dug to my home specifically to prove that it could be done, and that was stupid. Although I enjoyed using it.
Sorry, this might highlight my own lack of knowledge on the. But what does it mean to stay synchronized, or what would happen if it became unsynchronized, and how could that, how would you become unsynchronized?
So in order for you to know whether you actually received money, you have to be able to connect all the dots from when the coins first came into existence until they came into your possession. Was there a valid signature? Was it were the coins rightfully transferred, not double spent? Things like that. Every 10 minutes, there's another 1 megabyte block, right? So you have to download roughly 1 megabyte every 10 minutes. This works out to be a very, very low data rate. We're talking, kilobytes per second level data rate, not certainly not megabits per second kind of thing. If you assume that all you need to do is, just stay synchronized at the tip, you don't need to validate where all the coins originally came from, then the hardware requirements, the amount of go way, 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 way down. The amount of time that it takes to start up a new node are effectively nil. The alternative, security model, which is the actual security model that Bitcoin uses, you start from the Genesis hash, just like the one thing that you must know is what is the original Genesis block. And then it verifies a whole bunch of things. I'm not going to say everything because there's actually quite a few things that it doesn't verify by default. But you can connect the dots from the time all the coins are created up until right now. What are all the valid coins that could be spent in the next block? And that is actually quite computationally intensive, way more than most of us early people realized. It's I've got a dog barking. A dog back there. But that actually requires pretty high level hardware. If you want to sync from 10 years ago till today, you're not going to be doing this on a 8-year-old computer in a day. When I first started doing Bitcoin, you opened your laptop and it wasn't even, you didn't even know that it was catching up. It did, it just happened instantaneously. But when Bitcoin started getting used to the point where we're bumping up against what was the artificially set 1 megabyte block size limit. People forget when that was set, that was chosen arbitrarily to prevent the equivalent of a spam attack because the fees were so low. Anybody could blow up the chain, and people are like, oh man, everyone have to download all of this. That's a waste. So they put a cap in, and the thought was, hey, when we get even close to it, we'll just change it, raise it. And so everyone had that sort of baked in belief that it's, something that we can change, and that synchronizing really shouldn't take that much time. And that's not true. It's not true at all. If you have, even moderately good hardware, it can take, half a day or more to sync. And why is this a problem? It's not a huge problem if it takes, say, a day or a week right now, but the way scaling works, right? You have to look at, is this going to scale linearly, exponentially, logarithmically? The dimension of the problem for scaling, we're not going to get anywhere as good as linear. If we want the whole world to be using Bitcoin, well, doing that on chain is going to be, you're not going to have hardware that can validate, trillions of transactions a year. Now, that could be done probably if all you do is stay synced at the tip, because the hardware requirements there go way, 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 way down. But if you choose that security model, you're basically requiring trust in the people who are making the blocks. And when there is no user side to enforce rules, you're going to have to trust them. And if you're going to be trusting a bunch of miners, now it doesn't necessarily have to be the exact same group of miners, right? You could ask all of them, what's the current UTXO set? But once you start moving down that slope, people are going to eventually violate that trust. So what has to happen, whether it's at 1 megabyte or 2 megabytes or 300 kilobytes, we have to change the dimensionality of the problem. We can't keep scaling, exponentially, and that's why off-chain scaling techniques, anywhere from transferring person to person on Coinbase, which is not what I would recommend, but is an off-chain scaling mechanism, to Lightning, withdrawing from, say, an exchange to Lightning, or using liquid network to achieve scaling. That's what's needed in order to keep Bitcoin useful over the long term. And that was something a lot of us early people, Bitcoin is easy magic internet money. There's no fees. It's great. It works instantly, right? Like it doesn't fit into that narrative. So.
Mm-hmm. So do you think we'll ever change the block size now, or is it going to stay set where it is?
I guess I don't have a great answer to that question. The fact that it's a networking protocol it means it should be very hard to change, right? People aren't talking about changing TCP and IP, right? Like, maybe they are, but I still don't know. But if it's something that obviously had to be done, for example, here's a great example. Suppose you could mathematically prove that Bitcoin will completely fall apart if the 1 megabyte block stays the way it is, that it must either grow or shrink. But if you can absolutely prove it, well, then everybody's going to agree that it should change, right? Just like if you supposedly, find some flaw in Bitcoin's economic model that says you have to have persistent inflation, right? Like if that were somehow proven, I guarantee you there will be 2 forks of Bitcoin, one that's going to maintain the cap and test and see if it's really true, and one that'll say, okay, we're going to fix inflation at 0.5% per year or something, right? And then you'll have 2 diverging pathways to see in the long run what what pans out. But it would have to be the kind of thing where you can actually prove it. Like, it's got to be definitely true, as opposed to the block size debate where we all just thought it should be true. We all felt it should be true. And we didn't realize our own relatively poor assumptions about security models.
Mm-hmm. And so to get everyone into consensus to make some kind of change like that, what would be required? Like, everyone would have to update their mining equipment, or?
Yeah, so there was a unintentional network split back in the spring of 2013, I think. And Luke Dasher, if I recall correctly, was the first one to recognize, hey, this was somebody changed the rules on us, and it was that rationale of, hey, someone changed the rules, therefore the old rules trump the new rules, even though it was an upgrade to the main Bitcoin client that caused the problem. And it was fortunate for all of us that Luke had that thought back then, and because the precedent, which is the appropriate precedent, especially for a network protocol, is that you should remain backwards compatible as long as possible. So things that could trigger a true hard fork would have to be, someone mathematically proves, hey, all of your coins can be spent by anybody, and you'll never know who did it, right? Some kind of quantum computing breakthrough, or something along those lines. But there's a lot of people worried about, the Bank for International Settlements proved that Bitcoin absolutely cannot work with a fixed cap, right? Like, well, I think that's nonsense, but that's the kind of thing that you debate and have scientific papers about, and ultimately you prove, right? That's what Bitcoin is, the experiment to prove that. But it would have to be some kind of complete showstopper in order for people to quickly gather around a hard fork. But there will be hard forks. In the minor hard forks in the future, the year 2038. Unix, in some sense, runs out of time. Time is a number, right? And numbers have to fit in memory. And depending on how much memory you set aside for a particular number, you can only count so high. And so somewhere in the year 2038, a 32-bit number will not be big enough, 2 to the 32nd power, which is pretty big. It won't be big enough to hold the number of seconds since January 1st, 1970, which is how Unix, I think it does milliseconds or something like that, but that's how time is represented. So eventually, there'll be a change that has to happen there. If Bitcoin were to become ridiculously valuable, 8 decimal places might not be enough. I don't know if that would require a hard fork to add more decimal points. But that's so minor things like that. There will be some type of well-managed hard fork, probably several years in advance, to address sort of minor issues. But it's yeah.
And then maybe this might be a good time to talk also about the blockchain satellite. What are your thoughts on that right now? And what have you've done your own satellite?
I've dug into this quite a bit. Sort of mirroring my reasons for wanting to get into Bitcoin in the first place. When I heard about the satellite, I was like, oh wow, that sounds really cool. I don't know anything about satellites, right? But the house that we moved to when I took this job that I'm at now came with satellite dish, and we're not really a TV family where you do iPads and Netflix and stuff like that, right? But I happen to have a little satellite dish. Cables are already run into the house. I just have to find them, right? And so in the back of my mind, I'm kind of picturing, okay, suppose I live somewhere where I'm not allowed to get Bitcoin, or I'm on the run, right? Like I have to physically move every night, and I was sort of picturing somebody driving his van, with a portable satellite dish, and he's like, oh, okay, I got to sell, my watch or my rifle or some valuable object to help facilitate his family's move across the board, something like that, right? So I'm like, okay, I want to prove that this can be done, easily, cheaply, and so that's why I set out to set up my own satellite dish. And I know nothing about satellites, and I learned an awful lot about how to do absolutely everything wrong. So anyway, what is Blockstream satellite, right? Blockstream satellite is broadcast data of all the goings on in the Bitcoin network over the last 24 hours. There are 5 satellites. They cover basically the entire globe, or at least any place where a human would conceivably want to be. And you can just point your satellite at the right point of the sky and just listen and download the last 24 hours of Bitcoin data. Obviously you need to start with a sync node up until the last 24 hours, but the rest it'll catch up if you've missed less than a day's worth. Doing this is fairly easy. Blockstream has put out satellite receiver software. They give very detailed instructions on how to download it, install it, and things like that. Pointing a dish seems really hard at first. Most of the difficulty, especially with the smaller dishes, is you kind of have to get it pretty spot on. And a lot of times when people are trying to align them, they're not getting really good feedback in terms of using a little satellite meter thing. It doesn't always give you very fast feedback. The Blockstream satellite software, if you use it right, actually you can give you a lot of information they don't talk about. But I was actually on the complete wrong frequency just yesterday, trying to point my dish at a different satellite. There's two that I can see from where I live. And I was like, I must be on it. I must be on it. And then I realized I didn't change the frequency. So all I did was go inside, change a command line. I'm like, boom, I'm actually pointed right at it. So without being able to, see the actual signal, I could tell from the, what was happening to the constellations, that I must be pointed at least a satellite, and this is the general area of the sky that it should be in. But it's anybody can do this. It's actually not that hard. I wrote up, a summary of my experience detailing pretty much just about every stupid mistake you can make. And put it on a website that I haven't used in like a decade. So anyway, so I did all this thinking, okay, I can, show somebody how with like $25 software-defined radio, a power inserter for $20, like you can, for $50, you can get this up and running.
So would this preserve, like, for instance, Venezuela is going through a rough time right now, and we saw a lot of transactions increasing on local Bitcoin exchange, and then all of a sudden they have, their power's out. Does that mean, like, would people using this satellite, that would kind of solve their ability at least to continue mining or running a node, but they could exchange peer-to-peer without using the local Bitcoin? Like, if they could still do commerce if they had this satellite, even if the power's out? Or
so we bring your own electricity, right? So you need a battery, some kind of AC inverter, which are cheap these days. So the broader question is, what are the use cases? So for people in adversarial environments, if you're simply, connecting the Bitcoin network over the regular internet, your internet service provider can figure that out, right? Like they can know, oh, hey, this is somebody who's connecting to the Bitcoin network. I wonder why. Hey, I happen to have, billing details for this person. I know where they live, right? Like, is this something that you want to be broadcasting?
mm-hmm.
I don't know that that's necessarily a wise thing, right? One, you get privacy, right? Nobody knows you're downloading this data. So that's one potential use case. If you live out, far from an internet, land-based, internet connection, say you have a satellite, connection for your home internet and you only get 500, megabytes a month. Well, that's not enough if you want to be downloading a 256 gigabyte, blockchain and validating it and, dealing with the traffic of, every day, 144 megabytes, that's kind of a lot, right? So there's a real use case, even in, America, for a good fraction of the population where they are not, they're not connected to the internet in such a way where they don't have a bandwidth cap. Even in, my town where I'm in, there are people that have bandwidth caps. They can only download so much. So that's another use case is, saving on bandwidth. I only realized, like, I don't know, within the last week or two, for everybody, even in places that don't have repressive regimes, who don't, who have good rule of law, like there's a good reason to have your own satellite. And I hadn't recognized this as a useful thing even for me, right? So my Bitcoin storage setup is, deep offline cold storage. If I want to use it,
I heard it involves, from your wife, she said it involves some, scraping onto steel plates or something.
Well, yeah, so I've used Crypto Steel, which I think is a great product, and I have two of them, and you need two of them in order to restore the seed to a tracer-like device. So in order for me to get both of them, it's going to take several days, right? I have to go to halfway across the country to a bank in the last state I lived in and, go in there and get to, in fact, I think only my wife, I don't know, we might need both of us. I can't remember. To get into the safety deposit box, grab, that one, go to another bank, several states away, it would take, I don't know, minimum, 4 days for me to actually get up and running. Why is that important, right? Well, I'm a physician. Lots of physicians have money. Lots of physicians have a lot more money than I do, right? They don't walk around being, fearful that someone's going to kidnap them, for a ransom, because they don't have, a huge amount of money immediately accessible, right? Well, with Bitcoin, you could, right? You could have very large sums of money immediately accessible. That's not smart. The biggest deterrent is lack of profit, right? There are bad people everywhere. So anyway, why would someone like me want to have a satellite node? Well, when I buy Bitcoin, which personally, that's not investment advice. I think now is not you could do worse than buying now. So when I buy right now, they periodically just send all of my coins to this deep cold storage, HD wallet type, right? And then it's sort of poof, gone, right? If I want to get to it, it's gonna have to be another big spike for me to want to spend some vacation time, to go, crack out the big safe, right? But with having my own satellite, I could have a completely disconnected offline Bitcoin node, right? Right now, my keys are analog because I don't trust a computer to, keep my keys safe, right? But if I have I can take a laptop or any kind of computer, take out its Ethernet card, take out its Wi-Fi, right? So it'll be, completely air gapped, so you could actually keep some funds reasonably, quick, ready to spend, which is, probably wise, to have some access to Bitcoin that way. And you could still pair it with a hardware wallet. You could sign the transactions, on that completely air gapped computer, bring it to another computer for transmitting. So that for the truly privacy conscious type people, like that's actually a very reasonable thing to want to set up. I think that might be, at least in the near term, probably what most users will end up being. There's a guy who goes by the handle Grubels on the internet. He's got a very nice article about how he set up his own little portable, completely off the grid, laptop, satellite dish, and he's got one of these Gotenna devices. These are basically they're radios, right? They're RF radios, and kind of like a cell phone, except there's no screen. It pairs with your cell phone, and you can relay Bitcoin transactions over, this. If anybody happens to be nearby, you can relay them, and it'll give sort of a best effort basis to try to transmit that your Bitcoin transaction till it finds somebody who happens to be on to be running a relay node that can connect you to the Bitcoin network. And actually, just set up a Gotenna. A modified one with a really big antenna on my roof, and there was a RF engineer who was happened to be sort of driving through town, and I saw him on Twitter. I'm like, hey, you should put one of those, on my house. And as I bought his first unit from Tourmaline Wireless, is their startup name, and I can reach broadcast wise about 20 kilometer range, roughly 10 miles around my house. So I just bought an Android phone, so I can set up the TX10 software so that I can become a relay, so people could drive, somewhere within a few miles of where I am, and transmit a Bitcoin node, and no one will know who did it, a Bitcoin transaction, right, and relay that to the network. And
that's awesome.
But why would something like that make sense, right? Well, in a truly adversarial network environment, say you're a woman fleeing an abusive husband, right? Like. Mm-hmm. Depending on what kind of software you have installed at home, you can figure out, oh, that person's connecting to the Bitcoin network, or they're sending money like I did. I don't want that to happen, right? So that's those will be some interesting things in the near future.
Mm-hmm. How many people do you think right now are making use of the Blockstream satellite?
Oh, that's a really hard question to answer. The satellite, you can also send messages to basically all of Earth by sending lightning payments and a message to their web server. And I've gotten I get messages all the time that are just broadcasting clear text, and I reach out on Twitter and say, hey, I got your message, so I've done that with 3 people, maybe 4 people, but there's one guy who runs every day. He's tweeting out headlines, news headlines that'll basically reach anywhere in the world. So for half a cent, he can send a bunch of headlines to North Korea, right?
Oh, wow, that's really cool.
It is super cypherpunk, right? You can send encrypted messages, right? So suppose I want to send you a message, right? And I don't want people to know, where it came from. I can connect, to the Blockstream website, submit a payment, submit a message. They'll give you an invoice to pay, and you put a bid on it, and it's just a marketplace for, where you are on that chain of transactions to be broadcast. And so there's a lot of uses for the satellite beyond just giving you Bitcoin data. The people are surprised to hear the way the satellite works. Right now, there's about 200 megabytes of Bitcoin data that needs to be downloaded per day, and people are like, well, why isn't it 144? It's like, well, SegWit actually does increase the block size. So there is more than 144 megabytes a day, so it's roughly 200 megabytes. The Blockstream satellite will broadcast that 4 times daily. The rolling lasts 24 hours. And then it'll keep you up to date, as transactions come in. If you add up, all this data that's happening, you get to somewhere around 100 kilobits per second, about 12-ish, 12 and a half, 20, it's a 12 and a half kilobytes per second. That's actually pretty low. That's with a small block size, you can easily transmit this over very narrow bandwidth, very inexpensive to rent satellite bandwidth. And so can't do that with gigabyte blocks, of course. But so with the extra bandwidth that's available on the, I presume, the smallest amount of space you can rent on a satellite, you can add a whole bunch of other data, and so now people can communicate with the world by bouncing it off a satellite in space. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. It's obviously you could send Bitcoin transactions and hope that someone relays them. But if you already can connect to the internet, maybe there's other ways, that you could be sending your Bitcoin transaction.
I think it's what you just said about it relaying news headlines that really brings it more into the speech zone than a financial transaction zone. So the way it would be regulated, if we need the free speech protections on this thing compared to, the bank secrecy protections, that raises a lot of legal questions on regulation for this. So that's.
Oh yeah, what constitutes speech is quite a complex argument, as I'm sure and probably a lot of the listeners. Encryption, right? That this used to be classified as ammunition. You couldn't export it. Blah blah blah. One of the things that obviously held back internet commerce in the early days was once it became legal to do commercial stuff on the internet, you didn't have good encryption, right? So people risked an awful lot to bring encryption to the public sphere, the legal public sphere in the United States, and they did that by using free speech. It's like, hey, I'm gonna write a book, and if you rip this book up and scan pages in and OCR it, it'll compile, eventually give you a compiler that you can compile code with, and that's how Zimmerman got around this whole PGP export thing. And it's Bitcoin is going to share some of that history. I think there will be a lot of difficult decisions that governments are going to have to make and people are going to have to make. And a lot's going to come down to, what does this particular right mean? What does freedom of speech mean? What is speech? And obviously interpretations can change from generation to generation for any right. Not any right is guaranteed. It's always a dynamic struggle to maintain.
Mm-hmm. It's been interesting just even watching the Fourth Amendment, and I think the Coin Center article they recently put out on electronic cash did a phenomenal job summarizing the transition that we've gone through with the Fourth Amendment. But that's the right to freedom of search and seizure. So the way it actually reads is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizure should not be violated. And basically, they just need a warrant and a probable cause before they can search. But then the third party doctrine came. So anything, even in your office or your home, that you're willingly exposing to a third party, then your Fourth Amendment right is no longer extended to that stuff that you've put in the public domain openly. And like, there's a huge stream of cases that look at like, what has someone made public? And like, there was one, people were doing drugs inside of their house, but someone could see in a window, and that was, deemed to be they were doing drugs in public. And then there was no warrant needed for someone walking by to, go in. So then it comes down, and then, with the advent of the internet and our phones, we're giving all of this information to Amazon and Google, and, the third party doctrine says that that's okay. Like, no one needs a warrant to search what we have freely given over. And then, but if we've taken precaution to keep certain things private, even if we're in a public place, if we've taken a lot of precaution to keep something private, it is subject to our Fourth Amendment right. So then it brings up the question, well, okay, the blockchain is public, people can see our financial transactions, but the fact that it's encrypted, we've taken some precaution to make it private. So it brings, that whole question.
And I guess how you relay a transaction could also come into play. And the I know with email, right? Like what does it mean to be publicly shared, right? So like, anyway, there's an answer to that, right? If your email has been sitting on your server for say 30 days, you're okay. If it's more, it's either 30 or 90 days, then it's considered something that can be, requested without a warrant. So that whole concept of, like opening someone's mail.
So we should be deleting our emails every 90 days, or?
Well, I mean, this has a definite answer. I am not a lawyer, but
I am, and I'm asking the doctor.
I think there is like a legit thing that says, if your email's been sitting around a while, they can snoop all they want, and that's something that I think, if I were. So as a physician, right, like where you work has to be a matter of public record, right? Like you automatically give up an awful lot of your privacy by virtue of, offering professional medical services, right? So I can't, I'm not like privacy paranoid, but I do think it's a little strange that, people could just go rifling through your mail, as long as it's old. Jim Harper has a great, I don't know what to call it, a book or what, writing on the use and misuse of identity. You can find it, I think I got it on Amazon, but anyway, Jim Harper is a great guy and has a lot of insights into how people misuse and abuse identity. And right now we basically have one identity provider for most people. You get a driver's license, it's got, your name, your address, telephone, not telephone number, but height, weight, like all sorts of stuff that you shouldn't need, say, to buy a beer, right? Or to buy some ethynylated beverage, right? And so I can imagine being female, right? You go to a bar, there's some creepy dude back there and you want to buy a drink. He's like, can I see your license? And you're like, I have to divulge my address to you? Like, pretty weird, right? And well, the market for identity services is not really existent, unless you talk about the black market for getting other people's identities. So that's another thing that's really, really screwed up. In terms of Bank Secrecy Act and what is publicly, what is something that is reasonable, for people to not expect privacy on. There was a time where there was such a thing as like you would have a private relationship with your banker, right? Like if you come and talk to me as a physician in the context of medical care. That's not something I'm allowed, at least not by my profession, to disclose to anybody, not even the president, right? So like, I think there are limits on, things that you share in the course of doing business, if you can your business, that aren't, discoverable. But it's and that's the way we want it in medicine, right? If in the course of committing a crime you hurt yourself, I'm there to help you, right? Like there should be no barrier to you bringing your life for treatment. That's not, we're not the police, right? Like our duty is to, the needs of the patient come first, right? And I'm not suggesting people try to use the medical system as some ways of, hiding themselves from crime or whatever, but it's, there are limits on the kinds of things the government can get to, at least if not legally, then professionally.
Yeah, same thing. with the attorney-client privilege, but I did work at a bank for a number of years before going to law school, and yeah, nothing was nothing was private about the transactions. And I remember being kind of, I guess, naively shocked about it on the first couple of weeks there. I had started as a trader for TD Ameritrade, and then I switched to being like a personal banker. It was called a financial advisor, but I was just at the branch, and I would open accounts, do mortgages, and mutual funds for individuals and anything else. But our managers would come with a list of, each person's cash holdings and, say, oh, this person's holding like 400 grand in this account. Why don't you give them a call, see if they want to move it into a mutual fund, or, like all directed around getting more sales for the company. But it was like, whoa, like they have no privacy on where, what they're holding in any accounts, and, their full address and everything. Like there's so much KYC needed. And then we started taking the, anti-money laundering training and, looking for how people are structuring transactions. And there was so much focus on just knowing everything about the client, and such little privacy for them.
That brings up a sort of an interesting corollary, right? In effect, the federal government has deputized a bunch of investigators who are required to gather evidence in advance of a crime for the prospect of possibly prosecuting somebody for something, involving money. And I get it; it's a lot easier to follow the money than it is to do the actual investigation of a crime, and it's an important control point to be able to, because in the early days when people were doing, Bitcoin, money transfer stuff without a license and not recognizing, they just thought they were the most brilliant, business people, right? It's like, no, you're not a genius, right? Like you're just being used by people who are stealing credit cards and buying Bitcoin. And, that's why they give you a discount on money, right? Like so there's a legitimate role for wanting to, to protect against money laundering itself, because sometimes finding the actual crime is, just too much work for society to go through. But to deputize, basically every bank and require them to perform work, I guess I don't know, how that gets legally justified. Apple could tell the FBI to go shove it when it comes to unlocking a phone, and they basically say, "Hey, look, we don't work for you. You can't compel us to, be slaves for the government." And it sounds like that, from what I recall, that court case never really got anywhere because the FBI said, "Oh, never mind, we were wrong. We can actually figure this out ourselves." But I don't know. That's I don't know how much banking right now is fundamentally hampered by the amount of work they have to do. So it just cuts the marketplace down. The number of people that could potentially interact with a bank goes down because there's work involved in taking their money.
Mm-hmm. And for that whole, like the requirements of like reporting stuff to the Department of Treasury, there's those suspicious activity reports. I think that Coin Center piece showed that when it first started, there was 60,000 reports filed in 1996, and in 2017 there were 3 million reports filed. So it's like, a lot of work to file all these reports and keep track of it. And the requirement for filing it is so broad. Like it's just if it seems like it might be illegally got funds, and so the banks have no. There's no incentive for the bank not to report something, because then they could get in a lot of trouble, lose their licenses, be faced with big fines or criminal charges, versus just hand it all over. We'll be safe. We won't have to pay anything, basically. Is
right. And my understanding, at least for the SARs, is that you're not allowed to know if a SAR has been filed involving you, right? So like there's no... It doesn't matter if you're wrong. It does, you just file as many SARs as you want. Be suspicious about everything, and the consumer, the person who could potentially be negatively affected, by misidentification as a suspicious user of the money system, they have no recourse. Which brings in to play like due process, right? Like I exchange information with my bank. It's a part of required information exchange as a means of doing business. Like the Supreme Court has decided that therefore I can't expect privacy in anything I tell my bank because it's, a necessary function of doing business with them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess I could be deprived of search and seizure, protections and due process because that's been decided. But when you start moving into, the next generation of things where you're not going to have to know everything about everybody in order to be their financial service provider, that's going to raise a lot of interesting questions, for decentralized exchanges and things like that, where Eric his
Shapeshift?
coin, yeah, shape,
Oh.
Shapeshift, yeah, and when they start, is like, dude, all I need is an email address, which is true. That's actually all they really need in order to provide services. They've since taken a different tack, and they're now collecting stuff that isn't necessary for the purposes of them doing business. And it would be interesting to see does the Bank Secrecy Act truly apply to them? If so, I obviously don't envy the first person to take this to the Supreme Court. But if it's not information that's truly necessary for the conduct of business,
which we know it's not, because they were in business for years without collecting that information.
Yeah, it's that'll be interesting to see how it gets tested. The Coin Center report, I love the guys at Coin Center, by the way. Shout out to them. I've been donating, periodically to fund my wardrobe every year. It's the only shirts I wear outside of scrubs are basically Coin Center shirts. Anyway, smart guys doing it the right way. One of the things that they did mention is, as a software developer, right? Like if I, program something that that enables fungibility, am I complicit in a crime? Am I an accessory to a crime? Right? Like these are legit questions that a lot of people would like to say, yes, you're criminal.
The CFTC put out something recently saying that, the smart contract programmers can be held liable for whatever they're programming. So I loved how Coin Center kind of dispelled that, because I had a few people contact me and say, how, what is my liability for whatever I created? And
my understanding is that it was a sort of a hypothetical, people always ask you legal questions, like they give you a hypothetical case, right? I think it was somebody important at the CFTC talking through a hypothetical worst case scenario where somebody purposely engages, in the writing of software with the explicit purpose of, committing a crime.
That's key. You need that explicit purpose, right, and intent to,
right,
a crime with the software.
Right. Intent is always a very soft, squishy, malleable issue, right? So it gets, whenever judgment is involved, it actually gets, a lot easier to deprive someone of their rights. Ironically, even without judgment involved, it's very easy to deprive people of their rights. Second Amendment, right? There's a couple commas that are, confusing a lot of people, right? It seems relatively straightforward, but if words don't mean what they mean, and commas now imply something different, then guess what? All of a sudden you don't have the right to keep and bear arms, right? So it's this, even with explicit things, it's a slippery slope, much less with things that require judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Caitlin Long put out an article a couple of months ago, I think it was like last summer, that also looked at the successful prosecution of money launderers and terrorists through the collection efforts of the Bank Secrecy Act, and it was like less than 1%. So
they publish this data. I've gone to their website and looked at the Financial Crimes Division of FinCEN or whatever. They have like all the data, and they give examples of like their, hey, we did a really good job. See, here's an example. And I remember reading one of them was a guy was sending money to himself outside the country for business purposes. And because of suspicious activity reports, they were able to catch him performing transactions under $1,000 sequentially in order to not generate currency transaction reports. Currency transaction reports are, I think it's $10,000 is the limit. And then if you do like say two $9,000 transactions, then it's a crime. And the name of the crime is called structuring. It's not dependent on unlike money laundering, where like you have to prove the money came from a bad place. Like for structuring, it's pretty easy. There's no So the guy sent himself money, and gets to go to jail because of the SAR. It's like, well, interesting. I'm glad that we're, doing a few million of these a year so we can catch people who are, quote, structuring, not guilty of any other crime, right? Like, this is kind of weird, right? So anyway, I encourage people to go on the website, look at the stuff, prove me a liar, prove me true. Like, it'll be eye-opening, it'll be educational.
Mm-hmm. And when the 10,000 limit was put in place in the 70s, that would be something like $80,000 today if it was adjusted for inflation, but it hasn't been adjusted for inflation. So, yeah.
It's a slippery slope, right? Our country was set up as a republic, meaning democracy doesn't trump everything. There are certain things that are, given to everyone as rights, and they're supposed to be inalienable. And the point was to restrain a democracy, to provide for some measurable amount of freedom for everyone, and to make us a country that could never be ruled by tyranny. The easier you make a country to be ruled by a tyrant, it will eventually be. At least that's been every example of every society in history since the beginning. So power tends to grow, and it's not necessarily that people are like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this with the explicit intent of taking over, a country. It's just every little decision adds up to something that someday gives some bad guy, tremendous advantage over the people. And just like not using inflation adjustment, for your currency transaction reports, you're just giving more and more power to a centralized authority. And if we've learned anything about centralized authorities, is that eventually they abuse whatever trust is put in them, which is part of why our Constitution was made in the first place.
And the country formed in general.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also in that Coin Center article, so they looked at it and said, if someone were to push back on the constitutionality of the Bank Secrecy Act as applied to Bitcoin, it would result in two big questions. Like, the first would be, can they ban the publication of a Bitcoin transaction on a decentralized, when I say Bitcoin transaction, the exact word they used was electronic cash. So can they ban the publication of electronic cash or decentralized exchange source code as an would that ban be an unconstitutional prior restraint on protected speech? And then the second question they said it raises is in order to only publish electronic cash or decentralized exchange source code with surveillance backdoors unconstitutionally compelled speech. And their conclusion was that computer code is likely to be considered protected speech, either flat out as speech or as expressive content. Or conduct, expressive conduct. So the difference between it is if it's actual speech, it gets a strict scrutiny analysis. And if it's expressive conduct, it goes down to intermediate scrutiny. But either way, it's protected, and they have to, they wouldn't be able to just ban it outright or require the BSA. Now, I think that only works for the peer-to-peer or decentralized exchange software. It wouldn't work for companies that are taking custody of the assets. So that's the big difference there.
Yeah, there would be a lot of interesting legal challenges, right? So I could, create a Bitcoin transaction, sign it, convert it to basically numbers, print it on a piece of paper, walk outside and read it. Right? It was this long, garbly string of numbers. Is that speech? Right? Like that'll be a legit question. Like,
what are you communicating with that? Because can anyone understand? A part of speech is that the listener has to be able to understand what message you're conveying. So I don't know if you're conveying. I guess you're conveying.
If I'm talking to Jimmy Song, maybe he nice little card that shows different parts of Bitcoin transactions in the raw, so to speak. So I don't know. It's one you could say the same thing about someone speaking computer code, not like the source code, but the actual compiled binary code. It's something that someone would understand as a program, but beyond that, it'd be hard to know. But Bitcoin transactions, I think, are simple enough that you could easily find two people on the planet who could speak Bitcoin transactions to each other. But there will obviously be sections of it that will know, okay, this is signature data, and each individual piece of information in that is going to be meaningless in and of itself until you get all of it, right? But it's
But just the fact that the satellite can put speech out there, or speech can be embedded in every transaction, you can put a note in it or whatever. I think the more that the developers can do to incorporate speech-like components to the financial transactions makes it more of a blurred line where it will be very difficult to say this is a financial institution and this is transacting in money versus this is whatever else it is. We don't know fully what it's capable of yet.
If I had to redo the Constitution, one thing I think I would add is people should have a fundamental right to cash transactions, to be able to change items of value person to person without a requirement of having a third party intermediary or registering with the government, and obviously that wasn't the kind of way people were thinking back then. But, I don't, as far as I'm aware, you could make a law that says, hey, Brian, you're not allowed to use cash anymore. Right? Like,
yeah, certain countries are doing that. Like, even just the fact that you can't do like $10,000 or $2,000 if you can't explain where you got the cash is now, you're required to do these reportings, and you can't carry it through an airport, or there's all kinds of different countries, Australia and New Zealand coming to mind a lot, where they've really restricted cash. And in China, I mean, I think it was in 2012, they had something like more than 90% of their business was conducted in cash. And now today, less than 12%. And then they use that statistics of, who's buying diapers. That person gets a higher score on their like responsibility score or whatever, their social scores, because that person's a parent. And versus someone that's spending money on video games, they would get like slower internet speed because they're lazy and unproductive. So
that's actually kind of scary, right? So China, I'm not Chinese, never been to China, don't know a lot about Chinese culture, but I'm told there's this concept called walking jails, where people are not able to purchase travel services. Like they can't get on a train, they can't get on an airplane.
Yeah.
Their social conduct score isn't high enough to get them out of walking jail. I saw a tweet retweeted by somebody on my Bitcoin follow list on Twitter, where it was somebody who deleted all of his tweets and then tweeted out something along the lines of I apologize for all my tweets, I wasn't trying to subvert the Chinese government, something like that. And it's like, whoa, that's like a legit real person, that this is affecting. And I'm sure somebody out there will know who I'm talking about, because it wasn't a secret. But the more information that you give freely, or that is taken rightfully or wrongly, provides power. And the more power you have over people, the easier it is to tyrannize them. And I think walking jail in America would be considered by most people tyranny without due process.
But it's funny where how you get to a thing like that is just like millimeter by millimeter. It's not like all of a sudden today, if we made a walking jail, that would be put people in an uproar. But you take it little by little, you strip all those things away until something like that becomes normal. Hopefully not, but that's how it happens.
I have some massive defects in my education, and one of them is history. And one thing that I don't think people appreciate about history is, just like law, right? Like law is like an operating system for human interactions, right? History is what actually happened, right? And if you think about it, all societies evolve along similar themes, and just like the law may not have a specific Bitcoin related law in it, the interactions are basically the same. So what does history teach us about expansive centralized power, right? Like, well, there's somewhere around 80 million people who died in the last 100 years from governments making their people easy targets and then targeting them and then getting rid of them, right? Like it's we are fortunate that hasn't happened in the United States, but go to ask Russia, what their history is. Obviously, 6 million Jews in Germany, right? Like this is a real thing with relatively recent examples, and it's a repeated process for thousands and thousands of years. Bad guys get power, and then they make their opponents weak, and then they attack them. It's not that at any one step someone's like, oh yeah, in 5 lifetimes after I'm dead, I want to see this happen. Therefore, I'm going to change this law. It's just what is the end result of heading toward this particular centralization of power. And I think a lot of people are, at least currently, a little bit worried about presidential powers in our country, and whereas they might not be if it were someone else in office. It's raising good questions about what should the limits of power be.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah, it's all very exciting to watch, mm-hmm. And I think like the community, even with all the, so I think you are more on the maximalist side. Is that correct? Or?
Oh yeah, so right in with money, right? Is this going to be hey, we'll split up the pot, or is it going to be a winner take all? And I think, long story short, it is going to be a winner take all. The winner will have to provide what Bitcoin used to provide us when we first got started, right? You're gonna have to have some means of having a relatively frictionless transaction that requires like basically the minimal time to confirm. That certainly wasn't true in December 2017, where people were paying $50 a transaction, and it might not be enough to get in the next block.
But was that was that Bcash people spamming the network that caused some of that, or?
I don't know. My gut says no, but I honestly don't know. If people were truly spamming out of non-business necessity, they spent a lot of money doing it. I don't have any insight on that. I'm sure there are people who do, but it is curious how the transaction on-chain transactions fell off a cliff. But I think it does show you that there is a real demand. People have a legitimate demand to transact person to person. I think it's sort of a fundamental need of humanity, just like talking to people, right? People will engage in monetary interactions, and there will be a market for that, right? Like go back to gold is money days, right? Like people were willing to tolerate roughly 2% new money being dug out of the ground, right? If I went and dug money out of the ground tomorrow, you'd say I was counterfeiting money, right? Like, gold digger, right? Like that's sort of a derogatory term. That's a derogatory term, not just in our culture. Like that's a universal derogatory term. That if you can't find anything better to do than to, make everybody's money less valuable by digging your own, so people have always resented, this numerical inflation of the money supply. Bitcoin is a great example of where that doesn't happen. At least it's going to be capped, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's they could go off on a whole bunch of tangents on this, but I probably shouldn't.
Well, the reason I was asking was because I think it shows, that recently we've seen the leaders of some other coins coming, kind of losing their minds on Twitter and things like that. And it just shows, that's, I think, one of the main appeals for Bitcoin is there really aren't there's not one central, leader that determines the outcome of the whole thing. So,
yeah, I think right now with the market, there's a market demand that's not being met for person-to-person payments, right? So a lot of these ancillary networks will have value during that time period. As soon as Bitcoin can be created in such a way that it can be useful at scale to lots of people with privacy, it's hard to justify having other coins, right? So in the very long term, it doesn't make sense. You really only need one protocol for the transfer of electronic cash, and supporting multiple protocols. Like we don't see that with TCP/IP, right? Like there were other players early on, and they had value at that time, and they lost. There were network transfer protocols like Gopher, right? I don't know if you probably download the entire Gopher space onto your phone these days. But there were other protocols that have come and gone. Because they didn't maintain backwards compatibility. Actually, someone might have been Tour de Meester, or somebody tweeted an interesting article looking at the history of the Gopher transfer protocol and how it lost out to HTTP and FTP. And a lot of the backwards incompatible changes they made which basically meant everybody had to go, restart their servers, install new software, and these not useless, but unjustified hard forks were part of their downfall. Anyway, if you want to have everybody on the same network, y'all got to know where to meet up, right? Like you have to have one particular, consensus, point that you all can rally around. And if people are constantly trying to discover what that is, it's going to be very hard for you to gain network dominance. So these frequently hard forking coins, it's in the long term, it's going to be untenable. If people, so Ethereum, right? Like they've got these big, scary nodes, as Vitalik puts it, where it can be very, very difficult to find a peer to connect to. And if there's only, say, 2 or 3 or 4 or 10, these big, scary nodes that have a lot of data that some people claim is necessary for their business practices, well, now you're trusting a very small set of people, to be getting data from. And if so you need to be able to verify from Genesis for those, and that takes apparently an awful lot of computing resources. I don't know, I see these big chains and these frequently fragmenting chains as limited in lifespan. When people got started, did people think it was a scam? No. But at some point, people are going to have to say, look, I'm either running a scam or, I need to be honest with people and say, hey, this doesn't work the way we thought it's going to work out. Or maybe new science will get invented. No one's formally proven that it can't work. But
what do you think of I think I know the answer, you just said it, but the Facebook coin or like the JP Morgan coin, what do you think will be the outcome of those kind of things?
Yeah, so in order to have a network, to transfer money over, like you need a social network. Makes a lot of sense, right? Like people don't generally transact, with people they've never met, for things that they have no information on. So there is some sense in starting a network, where you already have all the connections made. So I get that. Having an additional source of surveillance on your activities, some people aren't going to care. In fact, probably most people aren't going to care.
Yeah.
But getting people to buy in and to actually wanting it, the social motivation isn't there for a stable coin, right? Like it's going to have only disadvantages compared to a censorship resistant. Or physical cash.
Using your PayPal or the Cash App or, Venmo, like those things are all pretty easy to transfer value on too. So it's like, what is the Facebook coin going to provide that those don't?
Right.
An extra step where you have to move your money into this coin, send it, and then probably move it back. Unless you can use that coin across eBay or, YouTube, like you can, who knows what they'll do with it.
Yeah.
Maybe it will become something that cross-platform has some kind of value.
I get it from their perspective, why they'd like to create a network and then sit as a gatekeeper toll collector, on said network and, collect rent as people go by. Like I get their motivation with Bitcoin. The motivation was, if not altruism, hey, this might be worth more someday, right? Like that motivated an awful lot of pretty smart people, to do something to contribute, right? Like back in 2013, 2012, and whenever the Bitcoin Foundation started, it started mostly as a way of paying Gavin for doing work, and I, as a virtual nobody, like, hey, they needed someone to run the elections, for the board that had interesting corporate setup. And so like, hey, I'll run these, who doesn't trust a doctor, right? And so I, ran what I felt was, as clear and transparent and cryptographically verifiable an election as I think is possible. But Bitcoin solved the social motivation problem. I personally don't believe Satoshi had a clue what he was making when he made it. He put together some pretty clever primitives, and it became something that I don't think that maybe we understand what it is fully yet. But
that's cool. Anything else that maybe I forgot to ask that would be interesting to talk about?
It'll be interesting to see at some point if Bitcoin continues to succeed. Politicians are going to have to start taking some kind of view, and I would be surprised in the next 10 years if you didn't have differing political parties with different views on free speech and transfer of value, and I think that'll be sort of the rhetoric. Obviously will come before the law, right? I think that's where people can, if they want to peripherally keep a pulse on what's going on, pay attention to the powers that be and the people who their profession is to get other people to vote for them, right? I think that'll be sort of the harbinger of what's to come. But
Have you been following the Yang Gang memes?
is this that guy that wants to give everybody $1,000 a month, free and clear?
Yeah.
Interesting. I think I tweeted at him something about, is a quote, and I really don't remember what it's by, but it says something like, once people realize they can vote money out of the treasury, their democracy has it's doomed, right? And we've divorced our money from any kind of physical hard cap, right? It's taken us maybe 40, 50 years to like, hey, we can vote money out of the treasury, let's do it. I think that's a bad idea. I think we know where that road leads. I think history has taught us that. But we've also done a pretty good job of making sure people don't learn history, and they don't learn the point of history. They just think of it as like a long, boring set of facts as opposed to a template for what's to come. Yang wouldn't like Bitcoin.
Well, actually, he's a 2013 Bitcoiner or earlier, because he was tweeting about it in 2013. And his whole premise is to tax the robots that Amazon, employs, and like tax the bus drivers that end up, the truck drivers that become robots. And I listened to his whole, I thought it was all a joke.
It's the guy running for president, right? Like we're talking about the same Yang? Okay.
Yeah, Andrew Yang, $1,000 a month, get your Yang bucks. But unfortunately, I wouldn't get any because I'm not a citizen. Green holders wouldn't get them. But his dad was like a PhD in some kind of specialized engineering and got like 60 some patents for IBM and other big companies. And like he's well spoken. And I was surprised because I thought it was all a joke about this universal basic income. And then he kind of he won me over a little bit. But
interesting. Well, you should vote for him. Apparently, everyone's allowed to vote these days.
Yeah. But it's like you said, like, now that, it would just be the same as doing some more QEs, like, oh, big deal, print some more money and pay it out to everyone. I mean, what the end result of that leads to, like, does it create hyperinflation? Does it crash the economy, which is good for Bitcoin? Or would that even be good for Bitcoin? Like, it raises a lot of questions that I haven't fully thought through.
Yeah. What you want to look up a scary fact? St. Louis Fed, they've got some nice interactive graphs that you can plot, say how much physical currency is in existence, plotted over time for say the last since before the financial crisis. And what you learn is, wow, there's a lot more physical cash around than there used to be. Remembering off the top of my head, it used to be something like $800 billion of physical currency existed, which seems small, but we think about how money actually works, like, banks lend out and there's fractional reserve and blah, blah, blah. So the real circulating money supply is obviously much bigger than that. But during the financial crisis, they printed a lot, like, to $3 or $4, $5 trillion worth of physical currency. Now, obviously prices haven't, gone to match that because there's other aspects of the, how money trickles down through the system. And, but we've been, several, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 years of, a quadrupled money supply, where is massive inflation, right? Like, where did all that money go? I don't know. I don't have a clue. But like there is a real science behind trying to, keep inflation, in a certain range with, bank regulations on, reserve requirements and interest rates and stuff like that. And but it does seem like, a powder keg, like you've just added a little bit more charge to your cartridge, right? Like a little more powder in there, right? So it makes me nervous. It makes me sort of not super trusting, but I obviously don't know what's going to happen. Again, if we use history as a guide, it ain't a good thing, but at least it's never been a good thing in the past. So it could be that we're fundamentally different than, all humans before us, or, we're bound to repeat some parts of history.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, where can people find you? Like, what's your Twitter handle?
Oh, don't find me. No.
No.
uh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, if I'm seeing
Tell us your
you,
address,
then
please.
that's something. No, I say if you see me professionally, you're probably hurt or sick or ill. But I know I'm at underscore DRGO, short for Dr. Goss, on Twitter. But if you're interested in putting up your own satellite, you can go to drgoss.org. That's a very old website where I basically just moved everything off the front page and started over because I haven't touched it in like a decade. But yeah, if anybody's interested in setting up a satellite, I think it's wise for the reasons that we talked about, and anybody can do it. Yeah, so that's that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. This was like really fascinating information for me to learn. Hopefully, everyone else found it just as educational. And thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.